Good morning, young people. We're going to talk today about Gatsby chapter 4 with a specific focus today on the function of the sequence of events throughout the plot. So the first thing that happens in this chapter is Nick reads off a series of names that he had written down of people who had visited Gatsby's house for the parties. A lot of times students kind of skip over this part or find it really boring, but I think it does provide an important insight and emphasizes some of the key ideas that we've been discussing. The names he mentions from East Egg are typically a little bit old school, whiter names, a little bit more waspy names. There's a mention of Yale. The only job that's mentioned among those names is somebody who was a doctor. And there's reference made to characters who have white hair or white pants. Most of the emphasis is on lineage. Family names are mentioned, but very few jobs are mentioned in the East Egg names. The West Egg names, however, mention jobs more frequently, specifically people working in the film industry and theater. Also, some of the names mentioned, the names are more Irish, Italian, Jewish, German names, more like newer immigrant names that are mentioned throughout. And there's reference to prostitution, kind of like bringing in this criminal element that will be discussed later in the chapter. It just isn't another attempt here for Fitzgerald and Nick to differentiate between the two settings. We have the old money names and the values in East Egg, the values placed on lineage and heritage, whereas the new money names are a little bit more on profession and sort of newer status within the country. Gatsby is starting to be more developed as a character. He comes over, he talks to Nick. He visits Nick's house, and Nick talks about how he is very anxious and very mannered about how he's doing. His nerves are very present, and they continue throughout the drives. He's obviously very nervous about something, but I did want to make note of how color is used in this section. The first thing that's mentioned here is Gatsby's car, and Gatsby's car is described as having a rich cream color. It is bright with nickel. There's also a reference to green leather here. We see again sort of new money color associations, right? Cream is like an off-white. If white is associated with old money, cream would be a new money. It's not quite white, but it's sort of similar to white. Similarly, nickel, right? Not gold, but nickel is like a more mineral-based color. The reference to the green leather, again, green, a color that is sort of connected with newness, and things that are new. So we see Gatsby's car here sort of being used to present him as a new money figure. Old money we talked about in chapter 1, probably more of a focus on horses than cars, though the crossover happens at times. But the fact that it is specifically Gatsby's car as well paints him in a specifically like new money position. Similarly, later on in 64, there's a reference to Gatsby's suit. His suit is described as a caramel-colored suit. Caramel, again, like it's a bit of a stretch, but more of an off-white color or an off color. Similarly, caramel is a specific reference here, something that's sweet but not necessarily good for you. So we see Gatsby symbolically being developed as much more of a West Egg new money figure in his interaction here with Nick. Gatsby starts to give some history of his story and of himself to Nick as they drive over. And it's oddly a story of old money. It's a story of education and heritage, tradition, inherited wealth. He talks about how his family were wealthy people from the Middle West. They're all dead. He was brought up in America. He was educated at Oxford being one of the most historic universities in England. All of his ancestors had been educated there. It was a family tradition. This is a very old money presentation of things. However, as Nick says, this story sort of like becomes a bit questionable. He looks at Nick sideways. He hurries the phrase educated at Oxford. It doesn't sound completely natural, and Nick starts to begin to doubt things he says. Gatsby mentioned that he grew up in the Middle West, and then he references San Francisco, which would not have been a Middle West, but a West Coast city. He says that his family has all died, which is like a very convenient thing for all of his family to be gone if he is talking about the importance of his family lineage. He says he was educated at Oxford, which would be as valuable, if not more valuable, than wealth itself. from a tradition standpoint, but it's unnatural for him to say that. It's not a comfortable thing for him to say. It doesn't come easy. These old money attitudes, a result of Gatsby's sort of desire for privilege, they force him to create an old money life, but that comes at the cost of his actual history. And the sideways glance, the anxious storytelling are all very unnatural. They give him away. It's all far too suspicious for Nick. Old money would be much more natural with the way it would talk about a story. It would be at ease. Not only that, Gatsby seems to be very interested in impressing Nick, and old money would not really be worried at all about impressing Nick. Nick isn't naturally of an old money setting, so it wouldn't be something that they would be concerned with. We see this in chapter 1 when Nick sees Tom's house, and Tom just kind of like shows him around, but he's not really necessarily trying to impress him. As the car ride goes on, Nick starts to see more and more issue with Gatsby's story. At first, he finds him a little sinister based on the way he says he was educated at Oxford, the sideways looks. In fact, he says he felt that Gatsby was trying to sort of like pulling my leg. He was trying to pull one over on him. He thought the whole thing was crazy, and he says that he managed to restrain Nick's incredulous laughter. Nick wanted to laugh at this whole story. He mentions in chapter 3 that he hates dishonesty, and all of this is kind of threadbare. He finds Gatsby to be a character in quotation marks. None of it really sort of holds water for him. However, Gatsby smiles at Nick, and we talked about the power of Gatsby's smile. And it's revealed again, Nick, who was at first very skeptical and sarcastic about the way he talked about Gatsby, his tone begins to shift post-smile, and he says, "My incredulity was submerged in fascination." Now, after post-smile, he's a little bit more interested in this story. And we've talked about how this sort of charismatic smile that Gatsby gives allows people to see the best version of themselves, the version they've always wanted to see, and it works once more. Gatsby produces a medal from Montenegro, and all of a sudden, Nick buys in. It was all true. He sees all of these things happening, the travels, the far-off countries, the little trinket from Montenegro, a small country, and a photo of him at Oxford begin to make the story more believable in Nick's perspective. To that point, Nick had imagined Gatsby, to the point that Nick has imagined Gatsby with a crimson or rubied jewels. We've talked before, but crimson and rubies, these are the colors of old money, right? The color of wine, and a color that was mentioned throughout chapter 1 during the dinner party. So an emphasis, a repetition of the power of Gatsby's smile, and we see once again that this story that Nick finds as sort of ridiculous begins to become more believable thanks to Gatsby's charismatic ability to make you think the best of yourself. The two men, Nick and Gatsby, travel into New York. There's a beautiful description of New York across the Queensboro Bridge, and they find themselves at a speakeasy. It's the first time we've been to a speakeasy. Speakeasies were illegal underground bars where people could drink during Prohibition. And in the speakeasy, we are introduced for the first time to Meyer Wolfsheim. Wolfsheim is a particularly interesting character for many different reasons, but I think it's important to sort of dig into his character a little bit. The name Wolfsheim, a wolf being a sly, sort of sneaky predator. Wolfsheim references his assistant, a man named Catspaw. A Catspaw is a phrase to describe a person who is used to doing dangerous or distasteful, unlawful work. So immediately these two characters, and Wolfsheim specifically, are presented in a way that is comfortable with dishonesty, we'll say. Also, one of the things that's interesting about Wolfsheim, and a little bit controversial, is the way that Fitzgerald characterizes him. Wolfsheim is characterized predominantly with an emphasis on his nose and his nostrils. These are referred to frequently throughout his section. This is a common characterization, but really a stereotype of a Jewish character, referring to a Jewish character by a reference where their nose would be like a very stereotypical, offensive thing to do. He also uses dialect. Dialect is when characters, their dialogue is presented as it is said, as opposed to the actual word itself. So, for example, Wolfsheim said something instead of said something. He ate his food instead of ate his food. He talks about the connections he has instead of connections. He refers to Gatsby as an Oxford student instead of Oxford. By typing these words as they are said, we see Wolfsheim as kind of like a lower class character, at least in presentations. Gatsby, by contrast, is very concerned with how he presents himself and with the way he says words, and that they appear to be very mannered, whereas Wolfsheim is just speaking very naturally in a way that almost comes across as slang-ish. Gatsby speaks of Wolfsheim on a first-name basis. He calls him Meyer in this section, shows that they are very comfortable. And as we find out, Wolfsheim is very connected with a criminal element in the story, which kind of adds a sinister element to Gatsby. In this section, we find out Gatsby talks about how Meyer Wolfsheim is a gambler, and he's the man who fixed the 1919 World Series. This is an allusion to the baseball World Series in 1919 and what was known as the Black Sox scandal. The Chicago White Sox were playing in that World Series, and gamblers gave them money to lose the World Series on purpose so that the gamblers could make additional money from this. It's seen as a really a black eye on the sport of baseball. It's a very sort of like nefarious, infamous event. And in presenting this for the first time, Nick begins to see somebody as doing criminal activities or nefarious activities as opposed to them just sort of happening. Gatsby, by contrast, refers to it as just an opportunity. It was there, he took advantage of it. And so again, we see kind of a new wealth for new money to achieving riches and to achieving their wealth. Here, it is through a criminal element. Wolfsheim, who is clearly very wealthy, achieved this wealth through crime, through gambling, through nefarious means. Gatsby doesn't really see this as a bad thing. He just says it's an opportunity. But to Nick, it seems more dangerous in a sense, right? It also presents this kind of idea of the American dream in a corrupt way. It's not about building a satisfying life, but just accumulating wealth by any means necessary, even if that means is to break the law. This all happens in a speakeasy where people are making money off of alcohol, even though prohibition isn't enforced at the time. Wolfsheim is talking about making money through fixing the World Series and stealing money, essentially. There was the element of a murder that had happened earlier through organized crime. So all of these parts start to come out in this conversation that the characters have in the speakeasy. As the chapter carries on, Nick has lunch with Jordan. It's a major break. We move from the speakeasy to the Plaza Hotel tea room, which would be a very old money New Yorkish setting. And we find out that Daisy and Gatsby had met before. Jordan's telling this flashback of her life in Louisville when she met Daisy and when Daisy met Gatsby. Jordan hadn't even recognized Gatsby as the person that she had met before. This is a sign sort of that Gatsby is a very different person than he was when he was in Louisville and when he and Daisy had first met. And it was obviously a serious relationship they had at the time. There's reference to Daisy wanting to go to New York to say goodbye to Gatsby before he was sent off to war, and she was obviously prepared to call off her wedding. It also tells us the story, Jordan tells us the story of Daisy and Tom's marriage. Daisy didn't really want to marry Tom at first. The night before the wedding, she has this drunken meltdown and just tries to call the whole thing off. She seems happy for a moment, but right after the wedding, while they're in the West Coast, Tom is cheating on her immediately and is caught cheating on her when he gets into a car accident. Gatsby's motivations through the story also begin to be more clear. And we see here that Gatsby has had a reason for all of the things he's been doing so far in this chapter. He bought this house, this massive house that's next to Nick's apartment, to impress Daisy. Daisy makes the connection of Gatsby at the first dinner party in chapter 1. She hears the name, and Jordan reveals that she later came and asked her about Gatsby. And this sort of sets off some events. Gatsby, it is revealed, has done everything without Daisy knowing that he was kind of there as he attempted to claim her love. And we see, in contrast to the scene in the speakeasy, which shows a very corrupt version of the American dream, this is kind of Gatsby showing the purest form of the American dream. He is doing things to achieve love, and he's doing it for love. Daisy in her first marriage chose money and security over love, but Gatsby pursued wealth to provide Daisy the thing he lacked when they first met. He's really trying to recreate the past they once had, only with a wealthier version of himself. This all comes to fruition through the house, and Gatsby's house now becomes a symbol of his sort of desperate, enduring love for Daisy. He built this impressive thing and has thrown these impressive parties so that he could try to capture her attention. Meanwhile, we also see a very vulnerable version of Gatsby through all of this and through Jordan's telling of the story. Basically, he did all of this and he set up all these different parts in motion so that Nick could invite Gatsby over for lunch and have Daisy show up. Or have Daisy over for lunch and have Nick show up. All of this was done kind of because Gatsby was too afraid to ask her or present her with any of these options himself. Right? Everybody sees Gatsby as a king. They see him as confident, as a dangerous man. But in reality, he's kind of just a childish schoolboy who had a crush on this girl, and he has a lot of money. And so he throws these parties. He buys this house. He does all of these things. But a lot of it was just because he lacked the courage to invite her. And so he employs Jordan to speak with Nick, to have Daisy over to his house, and then have Gatsby show up. All this was just because he wanted her to see his house. And Nick was right next door. And so Gatsby's trying to get Nick to invite her over so that he can then be present and show off this big old house that he has. The chapter sort of comes towards a conclusion with this interesting quote. A phrase is beating in the ears with the heady excitement of Nick. He says, "There are only the pursued, the pursuing, the busy, and the tired." And this quote is seen in like a lot of different ways, but the primary function, I think, is to show the interconnectedness of all of these characters. And if we break it down bit by bit, we can see how they can apply to lots of different people involved in the book. There are the desired, the pursued, are the desired, and those who are pursued are the people in a class above. For the no money people of the Valley of Ashes, this would be anybody out on Long Island. For the new money people, this is the old money people of East Egg. There are the pursuing. These are the characters who are chasing something. These are the characters without money or less money. It could be the no money people who are chasing any sort of a life. It could be the new money people who are chasing an accumulated wealth. It could even be the old money people who are chasing sort of an elevated status that separates them from everyone else. There are the busy, those who are always doing something. The no money people who are always working. The new money people who are chasing a lifestyle of the Roaring Twenties that was a busy, active, social lifestyle. And then there are the tired. The tired can be the no money people who are exhausted from having to work all the time. The tired could also be old money people who have so much leisure that they have nothing to chase and they can be relaxed and just sort of sit by and watch the world happen. So in this quote, we see Nick sort of taking all of our characters and all of our social classes and collapsing them into one, right? And showing that in the larger narrative, everybody is a part of this system that is sort of feeding into each other, where everybody is looking around at what they have and what others have and working towards something in this concept of a kind of an American dream of sorts. With all this in mind, I think it's important to look at the events of the story and just kind of consider how all of these things have led to each other. If we look at the first 4 chapters, things begin to become a little bit more clear, and the bigger picture of the story and the story's narration and narrative becomes a little bit clearer. We see now at chapter 1 at that dinner party with Daisy. This is the first time that Gatsby is mentioned, and our introduction to the old money and the mentioning of Gatsby as a character starts to set events in process. In chapter 3, Nick is invited to Gatsby's party. He mentions how he was one of the only people to actually have an invitation to the party. But now we see why. Gatsby wanted him to be there so he could start to make connections and work towards this introduction. Jordan meets with Gatsby at the party, and we don't really see much about it, but we know that something is said, and now we see what it is that was said. The story of Gatsby's past and his relationship with Daisy is the thing that he talks to her about. She's so amazed by it, she's taken aback by it, but she couldn't say anything in that moment. We see Gatsby's lunch with Nick here in chapter 4. What was the purpose of that? It was to make a stronger introduction and to sort of present them in a friendlier, social at lunchtime manner, right? We see that Nick's meeting with Jordan was influenced by Gatsby and sort of acts as a catalyst for that. And in this meeting, Jordan tells Nick the flashback and the whole scene that happens with Daisy, bringing all of these character stories a little bit more in focus. We see what Gatsby's role is and his motivations were here. We see their involvement with Daisy, and we see sort of like the part that Nick plays in the middle of all this as he sort of acts again within and without, right? As an active figure in this, but one who is removed from the core events as a whole. So with chapter 3, with this chapter, or chapter 4 in mind, I want you to sort of think about some discussion questions you might have for our class, our next class. And think about some of the events that have led to this moment and the events that happen in this chapter. And the key word here being function. What is the purpose or the function of all of these events in connection as chapter 4 starts to bring things more into a clearer picture?